The town of Cedarville lay hidden in the rolling foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by dense forests that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Its streets were quiet, its people bound by traditions and unspoken rules that left little room for outsiders. To the casual observer, it seemed a quaint, peaceful town. But those who stayed long enough learned that Cedarville was a place where power whispered in the shadows, wielded by those who wore badges and thrived on unchecked authority. Ethan Reed had been in Cedarville for 3 years. He lived alone in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of the forest, far enough from the town to avoid its piercing stares, but close enough to feel its looming presence. The cabin, built decades ago, was a simple structure. One room with a wood stove, a rickety table, and a creaky bed. It wasn't much, but it was all Ethan needed. The forest was his sanctuary. It provided the quiet and solitude he craved, its tall pines and thick underbrush shielding him from a world he'd long turned his back on. Ethan's days were simple: chopping wood, repairing the cabin, and occasionally venturing into town for supplies. His past life as a professional boxer, a name once revered in arenas across the country, felt like another lifetime. But Cedarville wasn't kind to outsiders, especially ones like Ethan. Though he rarely spoke to anyone, his presence alone was enough to make the townsfolk uneasy. Whispers followed him whenever he walked into the general store, the weight of their stares pressing against his back. He learned quickly to keep his head down and avoid unnecessary attention. It was a cold October morning when Ethan stepped outside, the ground frosted over from the night's chill. He pulled on his gloves and slung an axe over his shoulder, heading into the woods to gather firewood. The rhythm of chopping wood had always been therapeutic, a simple, physical task that drowned out the noise in his mind. As he worked, the sound of a distant engine broke the forest's silence. Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and listened. The hum grew louder, and moments later, a Cedarville police cruiser emerged on the dirt path, stopping at the edge of the clearing. Ethan's grip tightened on the axe. Uninvited visitors were rare, and those in uniform were even rarer. He squinted as 2 figures stepped out of the car, Deputy Barker and Officer Cole, men whose reputations preceded them. "Morning, Reed," Barker said, his tone laced with mock friendliness. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his smirk barely disguising the malice in his eyes. Cole stood silently behind him, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. He was leaner, quieter, but no less menacing. "Just chopping wood," Ethan replied evenly, forcing himself to stay calm. Barker looked around the clearing, his smirk widening. "Funny thing, this here's public land, but we've been hearing about some trespassers. Thought we'd come take a look." "I'm not trespassing," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Is that so?" Barker stepped closer, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. "Thing is, some folks in town are nervous. A guy like you out here, all alone, makes people wonder what you're up to." "I keep to myself," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. Barker circled him slowly, his eyes sweeping over the axe in Ethan's hand and the pile of wood nearby. "Sure you do. But maybe we ought to check your place, just to be sure. Wouldn't want any surprises now, would we?" Ethan's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew how men like Barker operated. They thrived on fear and provocation, pushing just far enough to assert their power without crossing any lines that would hold up in court. "There's nothing in my cabin but what I need to get by," Ethan said. Barker tilted his head, feigning disappointment. "Guess we'll find out. Let's go." Without waiting for permission, the officers gestured for Ethan to lead the way. He had no choice but to comply, his heart pounding as they followed him back to the cabin. The inside of the cabin was sparse, its walls bare except for a few shelves lined with tools and supplies. Barker and Cole wasted no time rummaging through his belongings, turning over chairs and rifling through drawers. "Real cozy," Barker remarked, kicking at a stack of firewood by the stove. "But you're awful far out here for someone who doesn't want trouble." Ethan stayed silent, his hands balled into fists at his sides. After several tense minutes, Barker finally straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his uniform. "Looks like you're clean. For now. But don't get too comfortable. We'll be keeping an eye on you." With that, The officers left, their boots echoing on the frozen ground as they returned to their cruiser. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them drive off until the forest swallowed the sound of their engine. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Back inside, Ethan sank into a chair, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. This wasn't the first time Cedarville's police had harassed him, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about this encounter felt different, more pointed, more personal. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he tried to bury long ago: anger. He stared at his bruised knuckles, the faint scars from his boxing days still visible. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he knew one was coming. And this time, he wouldn't back down. The sun was dipping low behind the treetops as Ethan Reed sat on the porch of his cabin, staring at the axe in his hand. His ribs ached from the tension he'd carried all day, and his mind replayed the encounter with Barker and Cole like a bad loop. Their smug smirks, the way they tore through his cabin, the veiled threats. It all clawed at the fragile peace he'd built for himself. The silence of the forest had always been his refuge, but tonight, it felt heavy. The once soothing sound of rustling leaves seemed distant and cold, as if the woods themselves had turned against him. Ethan reached for the glass of water on the railing beside him, the ice inside clinking faintly. As he took a sip, a noise broke the stillness. A car engine approaching, its low growl cutting through the quiet like a blade. His body tensed, his hand instinctively tightening around the axe handle. Moments later, headlights came into view, bouncing off the narrow dirt path that led to his cabin. Ethan stood, his pulse quickening as the car stopped a few yards away. It wasn't the police this time. The vehicle was a dusty silver sedan, its engine sputtering before falling silent. A young woman stepped out, her movements brisk but cautious. She was in her late 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She wore jeans and a worn leather jacket, her hands clutching a notebook and a recorder. "Ethan Reed," she called out, her voice steady but tentative. Ethan frowned, setting the axe down but not stepping off the porch. "Who's asking?" "Angela Porter. I'm a journalist." She gestured to her notebook. "I'm writing a story on Cedarville's police force, and I think you might have some insights." Ethan crossed his arms. "You've got the wrong guy." Angela didn't flinch. She walked closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "I don't think I do. You're Ethan Reed, the ex-boxer, right? You've been living out here for 3 years. I've heard the stories. People in town talk about you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then you already know I don't talk to anyone. Whatever story you're working on, I'm not interested." Angela sighed, her eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding forest. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble for you, but I've been digging into the Cedarville Police Department, and the picture isn't pretty. I know about Barker and Cole. I know what they've done to people in this town, and I know they were here earlier today." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" "I have sources," Angela said with a shrug. "And let's just say their behavior isn't exactly a secret. I'm trying to expose it, but I need more. If you've been on the receiving end of their harassment, you could help me." Ethan stepped back, leaning against the doorframe. "Even if I wanted to help, which I don't, what good would it do? You think anyone's going to care about what happens in a place like Cedarville?" Angela's expression hardened. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes it only takes one person willing to stand up and say something for others to follow. I've seen it happen before." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his mind churning. He didn't trust her, or anyone else, for that matter. But her words struck a nerve. "You should go," he said finally, his voice cold. Angela hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if you change your mind." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a card, placing it on the porch railing. "That's my number. Call me anytime." She turned and walked back to her car, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. That night, as the temperature dropped and frost began to creep across the windows of the cabin, Ethan lay awake in bed. Angela's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the memories he'd fought to bury. He had been 26 when his career ended. A promising fighter, known for his relentless drive and unshakable focus, Ethan had climbed the ranks quickly. The night of the fight was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a title match against a veteran champion. The crowd roared as the bell rang, but the cheers turned to gasps when Ethan's fist landed a brutal hook that dropped his opponent to the mat. The man never got up. The headlines the next day painted Ethan as a killer, even though the punch had been clean. The guilt consumed him, driving him away from the sport and the life he'd built. Cedarville had been his escape, a place where no one knew him, or so he thought. But people like Barker and Cole had made it clear he wasn't welcome here either. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up outside, and Ethan sat up, rubbing his face. His ribs still ached from the scuffle earlier, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. He glanced at the card Angela had left, sitting on the table by the window. His instincts told him to burn it, to stay quiet and let the world pass him by. But a small voice in the back of his mind, one he hadn't heard in years, whispered something different. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to fight again. The next day, Ethan's routine was interrupted once more. He had ventured into town to pick up supplies, keeping his head down as usual. But as he loaded a sack of flour into his truck, he spotted Barker and Cole across the street, leaning against their cruiser. They were watching him, their expressions smug and predatory. Ethan clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. He finished loading the truck and drove away, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As he passed the town's welcome sign, a thought struck him. If they wanted to push him, he wouldn't break. He wasn't that man anymore. But if he was going to stand up to them, he needed to be ready. Back at the cabin, Ethan dug through a box in the corner of the room. Inside were the remnants of his old life, photos, newspaper clippings, and his gloves. He pulled out the gloves, their worn leather soft under his fingers. He had run from his past for too long. If Cedarville's police wanted a fight, they'd get one. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees as Ethan Reed stood outside his cabin, staring at the pair of boxing gloves in his hands. The leather was cracked and worn, but they felt familiar, like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Memories of his time in the ring surged back, unbidden and relentless. The sound of the crowd, the sharp sting of a jab, the raw energy that coursed through him during a fight. But this wasn't about glory. Not anymore. Ethan tightened his grip on the gloves and hung them over a nail by the cabin door. He wasn't sure yet what he was preparing for, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't be caught off guard again. That afternoon, Ethan ventured into the forest to collect firewood, hoping the rhythm of chopping would clear his mind. The sharp crack of the axe splitting logs echoed through the trees, a steady counterpoint to his thoughts. As he worked, he became aware of a presence. The rustle of leaves, the faint snap of a twig. Ethan stopped mid-swing, his instincts kicking in. He turned slowly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. "Ethan," a voice called out softly, startling him. Angela Porter stepped out from behind a tree, her notebook tucked under her arm. She raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Relax," she said. "It's just me." Ethan exhaled, lowering the axe. "What are you doing out here?" "I wanted to follow up," Angela said, taking a cautious step closer. "I figured you'd be out here, and after our last conversation, I thought you might have changed your mind." "You shouldn't be here," Ethan said, his tone sharp. Angela ignored his warning. "Look, I know you're angry. At the town, at the cops, maybe even at yourself. But you're not alone in this. What Barker and Cole are doing, it's not just about you. There are others. People who are scared to speak up." Ethan hesitated. "Others?" Angela nodded. "I've been talking to people in Cedarville, quietly, of course. There's a pattern. Harassment, intimidation, excessive force. And it's not just the police. The whole system's complicit. Complaints go nowhere. Records get buried, and the victims are left to fend for themselves. You're not the first person they've targeted, Ethan, and you won't be the last." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Why me?" Ethan asked finally. "Because you're the one person they can't fully control," Angela said. "You don't rely on the town for work or social connections. You're an outsider with nothing to lose, or at least, that's what they think. But you have something they don't, a voice. And if you're willing to use it, we can bring this to light." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. The idea of standing up to Barker and Cole, to the entire Cedarville system, was both terrifying and tantalizing. He'd spent years running from conflict, but maybe it was time to stop. Angela reached into her jacket and pulled out a small recording device. You don't have to decide right now, but if you've got a story to tell, I'll listen. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, turning Angela's words over in his mind. He had seen Barker and Cole's cruelty firsthand, and now he couldn't shake the thought of others suffering in silence. He picked up the recorder Angela had left behind and stared at it. The device felt small and insignificant in his calloused hands, but he knew its power. A single voice, amplified, could do more damage than fists ever could. But as Ethan considered speaking out, a dark thought crept in. What if they came after him again? What if they didn't stop at threats and harassment? He glanced at the window, half expecting headlights to appear in the distance. He couldn't let fear control him. Not anymore. Ethan pressed the record button, the soft click echoing in the quiet cabin. He cleared his throat, then began to speak. My name is Ethan Reed, he said, and this is my story. The next day, Angela met Ethan at a coffee shop on the edge of town. He handed her the recorder without a word, his expression unreadable. Angela gave him a small nod of encouragement and slipped it into her bag. Thank you, she said. This is the first step. What happens now? Ethan asked. Angela sipped her coffee. I'll piece it together with the other testimonies I've gathered. Then we'll figure out the best way to release it, maybe anonymously at first. We need to make sure the evidence sticks before they can bury it. Ethan frowned. They'll know it's me. Probably, Angela admitted. But the more people we get to speak up, the harder it'll be for them to retaliate. Safety in numbers. Ethan wasn't convinced, but he said nothing. That night, Barker and Cole showed up again. Ethan had just finished chopping wood when their cruiser pulled into the clearing, the red and blue lights flashing ominously in the dark. Evening, Reed, Barker called out, stepping out of the car. Cole followed close behind, his hand resting on his holstered gun. What do you want? Ethan asked, his voice steady. We got a call, Barker said, his smirk widening. Someone reported suspicious activity out here. Thought we'd check it out. Ethan clenched his fists. I haven't done anything. Didn't say you did, Barker replied. But it never hurts to look. They circled him like wolves, their movements slow and deliberate. Barker glanced at the stack of firewood. Busy night, huh? Ethan didn't answer. Cole took a step closer, his tone low. You've been talking to people, haven't you? Stirring up trouble. Ethan's heart pounded. He forced himself to meet their gaze, refusing to show fear. I haven't done anything wrong. Barker's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. See, that's the thing, Reed. Out here, it's not about what's right or wrong. It's about knowing your place. You do well to remember that. With that, they climbed back into their cruiser and drove off, leaving Ethan alone in the dark. As their taillights disappeared, Ethan felt a surge of resolve. They might have power, but they didn't have control, not over him and not anymore. He turned toward the cabin, his fists clenched at his sides. If Barker and Cole thought they could silence him, they were wrong. This wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's. The air in Cedarville felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of unspoken truths was pressing down on everyone. Ethan Reed couldn't shake the tension lingering in the back of his mind since Barker and Cole's last visit. He had spent the night pacing the cabin, replaying their words, the subtle threat in their tone. It was clear now, they knew. Ethan sat at his small table, the recording Angela had taken from him echoing in his thoughts. He had told her everything about the harassment, the threats, and the town's complicity. For the first time in years, he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to believe that his voice might make a difference. But as the sun rose over the trees, doubt gnawed at him. Could he trust Angela to protect his story? And even if she did, would it matter? Angela Porter wasn't wasting time. Sitting in her motel room on the edge of Cedarville, she combed through Ethan's testimony, pairing it with the growing pile of evidence she had collected. Testimonies from townsfolk, many anonymous, painted a grim picture of Cedarville's police force. Excessive force, intimidation, and racial profiling were common themes. One file stood out among the rest. a report about a young man named Chris Miller who had been arrested 2 years prior. According to the complaint, Barker and Cole had accused him of trespassing, beaten him in custody, and later falsified a report to justify their actions. The case was quietly dismissed, and Chris left town shortly after. Angela knew this was more than a story. It was a battle for justice. She needed to move carefully. If the wrong person caught wind of her investigation too early, everything could unravel. Later that evening, Angela met Ethan in the woods near his cabin. She carried a thick folder of documents, her expression tense but determined. "I've got something," she said, holding up the folder. "Proof that this has been going on for years. Complaints, reports, testimonies. It's not just you, Ethan." Ethan frowned, taking the folder. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening as he read. "And this has all been ignored?" "Buried," Angela said. "The sheriff's office has been protecting their own, and no one's held them accountable. Until now." Ethan looked up at her. "What's your plan?" Angela hesitated. "We need more. Documents, recordings, anything we can find that proves this isn't just a few bad apples. We can't go public until we have enough to make it impossible to ignore." Ethan's stomach sank. "And how do you plan to get that?" Angela smiled faintly. "I've been doing some digging. There's a storage room at the sheriff's office, an old one they barely use. It's where they keep files that aren't digitized yet. If we can get in, there's a chance we'll find something big." Ethan's eyes widened. "You want to break into the station?" "Not exactly," Angela said, "but I need your help to get close. You know this place better than I do, and I know how careful they are about covering their tracks. If we wait, they'll destroy anything that could incriminate them." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. The idea of sneaking into the heart of the sheriff's office was reckless, dangerous. But as he looked at the folder in his hands, the weight of its contents settled in his chest. He nodded. "All right, but we do this smart. No mistakes." The following night, the streets of Cedarville were quiet. Most of the town had already gone to bed, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows over the sidewalks. Ethan and Angela parked a few blocks away from the sheriff's office, keeping to the side streets as they approached the building. Angela carried a small bag with a flashlight, a camera, and gloves, while Ethan kept watch, his every sense on high alert. The sheriff's office was a modest brick building, its architecture as unassuming as the town it served. Angela had done her homework. The storage room was in the back, accessible through a side entrance. "Stay here," Angela whispered, crouching behind a dumpster. Ethan grabbed her arm. "No. If something goes wrong, you'll need backup." Angela hesitated, then nodded. Together, they moved toward the side door. Angela reached into her bag, pulling out a set of lockpicks. "Where'd you learn that?" Ethan muttered. "College journalism class," she whispered back, a smirk tugging at her lips. The lock clicked, and Angela pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly. They slipped inside, the air cool and stale. The storage room was just as Angela had described, small, dimly lit, and cluttered with filing cabinets and boxes. Angela handed Ethan the flashlight and started rummaging through the nearest cabinet. Ethan kept watch by the door, his ears straining for any sign of movement. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Angela pulled file after file, snapping pictures of the ones that stood out. Excessive force complaints, internal investigations that went nowhere, evidence of racial profiling. "This is it," she whispered, holding up a thick folder marked confidential. "This ties everything together." But before they could leave, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them both. Ethan's heart pounded as the steps grew louder. He motioned for Angela to hide, his mind racing. They barely had time to slip behind a stack of boxes before the door creaked open. A flashlight beam swept across the room, and Ethan recognized the voice immediately. "Damn paperwork," muttered Deputy Harris, a junior officer known for his laziness. Ethan held his breath as Harris rummaged through a nearby cabinet, grumbling under his breath. Angela crouched low, clutching the folder tightly to her chest. After a few tense minutes, Harris slammed the cabinet shut and left, muttering something about a coffee break. The door clicked shut behind him, and Ethan exhaled in relief. "Let's go," he whispered. They slipped out the way they came, moving quickly and quietly back to the car. Back at the cabin, Angela spread the documents across the table, her face illuminated by the glow of a laptop. Ethan stood behind her, his arms crossed as he studied the files. "This is enough," Angela said, her voice filled with conviction. "We can go public with this." Ethan wasn't so sure. "And then what?" "They'll come after us harder than ever." Angela looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "That's why we make it big. We don't just tell Cedarville. We tell the whole world. Once this is out, they can't touch us without looking even worse." Ethan stared at the documents, his jaw tightening. He had spent years running from fights, but this one felt different. "Do it," he said finally. Angela nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Together, they drafted a post, attaching the damning evidence and crafting a story that would shake Cedarville to its core. When it was done, Angela hovered over the post button. "You ready?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "Yeah, let's light the fire." Angela clicked the button, and the post went live. By the time the sun rose over Cedarville, the post had spread like wildfire. Angela Porter's exposé, packed with damning evidence of police corruption and abuse, was being shared across social media, picked up by local activist groups, and even gaining the attention of regional news outlets. The headline read, "Small Town, Big Injustice. Cedarville Police Department exposed for years of corruption and abuse." It featured photos of documents detailing harassment, racial profiling, and excessive force, along with testimonies, including Ethan's, painting a clear picture of the toxic culture in Cedarville's law enforcement. Ethan stood by the window of his cabin, staring out at the forest. His phone buzzed constantly on the table, notifications piling up as the story spread. He felt a mixture of pride and dread. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. Angela had stayed up all night monitoring the response. "This is big," she said, scrolling through the flood of comments. "People are demanding investigations. Activist groups are tagging national outlets. We've got momentum." Ethan wasn't convinced. Momentum's good, but it won't stop them from coming after us. Angela set her laptop down and looked at him. "That's why we need to keep the pressure on. The more eyes on this, the less room they have to retaliate." At Cedarville Sheriff's Office, chaos erupted as Sheriff Donovan stormed into the station, slamming the door behind him. Deputy Barker and Officer Cole stood by his desk, their expressions a mix of anger and unease. "What the hell happened?" Donovan growled, throwing a printed copy of the exposé onto the desk. Barker leaned forward, his jaw tight. "It's Reed. And that reporter. They've been poking around for weeks." "You said you had him under control," Donovan snapped. "We did," Cole muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "But we didn't think he'd have the guts to pull something like this." Donovan glared at them. "This makes us look like monsters. You think the state's going to sit on their hands after this? If we don't shut this down, we're done. All of us." Barker's smirk returned, but it was darker this time. "Don't worry, Sheriff. We've got a few ideas on how to handle Reed. Just make sure it's clean," Donovan warned. "We can't afford any more mistakes." Later that day, Ethan was chopping wood when the sound of an engine cut through the forest. He straightened, his grip tightening on the axe as a police cruiser pulled into the clearing. Barker and Cole stepped out, their expressions colder than ever. "Afternoon, Reed," Barker said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Looks like you've been busy." Ethan set the axe down, his muscles tensing. "What do you want?" "Oh, nothing much," Barker said, circling him slowly. "Just thought we'd pay you a visit, make sure everything's in order." Cole lingered near the cruiser, his hand resting on his holster. "Nice little show you put on last night," Barker continued, his tone hardening. "You think people are going to believe your sob story? You think anyone's going to care?" Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "Looks like they already do." Barker's smirk faltered for a moment before he stepped closer, invading Ethan's space. "You've made a big mistake, Reed, and mistakes have consequences." Cole took a step forward, his presence a silent threat. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down. "If you're here to arrest me, do it. Otherwise, get off my property." For a moment, Barker's eyes burned with barely restrained rage. Then he stepped back, nodding to Cole. "Let's go. For now." As they drove away, Ethan watched the cruiser disappear into the trees, his heart pounding. By the afternoon, the town square was buzzing with activity. Small groups of residents gathered, their conversations heated as they discussed the exposé. Some were angry, dismissing it as sensationalism. Others were furious, finally finding validation for years of whispered complaints and unspoken fears. A group of younger residents, led by a local activist named Mia Turner, began organizing a protest. They carried signs reading, "Justice for Cedarville," and "Hold them accountable." Angela had anticipated the backlash, but even she was surprised by how quickly the town was mobilizing. She met with Mia and her group near the general store, helping them prepare for the protest. "This is just the beginning," Angela told them. "The more noise we make, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug." That evening, Ethan sat on his porch, staring at the forest as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. His body still ached from the years of isolation and neglect he'd endured, but something inside him had shifted. He reached for the gloves hanging by the door and slipped them on, their weight grounding him. He hadn't used them in years, but the movements came back instinctively. Jab, cross, hook. His fists cut through the air with practiced precision. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Angela approached from the side of the cabin, stopping when she saw him. "You're getting back in shape," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. Ethan lowered his fists, breathing heavily. "I need to be ready. If they come for me again, I won't go down easy." Angela nodded, her expression serious. "They're scared, Ethan. That's why they're pushing so hard. It means we're winning." Ethan gave a faint smile, but his eyes remained sharp. "Winning doesn't mean anything if we don't finish this." That night, Ethan woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. He grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering into the darkness. The faint glow of a cigarette gave Barker away, his figure partially obscured by the trees. Ethan's heart raced as he spotted Cole nearby, his hand resting on the barrel of a shotgun. They weren't here to talk. Ethan grabbed his phone, quickly dialing Angela's number. She answered groggily, her voice tense when he explained what was happening. "Stay inside," she said. "I'm calling the sheriff's office. If they're on your property, that's trespassing." Ethan hung up and turned off the lights, staying low as he moved through the cabin. He grabbed his gloves, slipping them on with steady hands. If they forced their way in, he wouldn't hesitate to defend himself. Outside, Barker muttered something to Cole, and the two of them moved closer to the cabin. But before they could act, the distant sound of sirens broke through the night. Barker and Cole froze, their heads snapping toward the road. Moments later, they disappeared into the trees, leaving Ethan alone in the dark. As the sirens grew louder, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the tide was finally turning. The morning air in Cedarville was alive with tension. The exposé had struck a nerve, and the community's response was growing louder by the hour. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, their voices united in protest. Handmade signs demanded justice, end police corruption, accountability now, and "We stand with the victims." Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the townsfolk chanted and held their ground. This wasn't the Cedarville he had known. Quiet, complicit, and fearful. Something had changed. "Ethan!" Angela's voice cut through the noise. She weaved through the protesters, her bag slung over her shoulder, and stopped in front of him. "It's working," she said, her face flushed with excitement. "The media's picking it up. There's talk of a state investigation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And the sheriff?" Angela glanced toward the station. "Locked in there with his men. They're trying to ride it out, but they're scared. They know the walls are closing in." Ethan scanned the crowd, spotting Mia Turner at the front. She stood on a makeshift platform, addressing the protesters with a microphone. "We've been silent for too long." Mia's voice carried over the chants. "Today, we demand accountability. No more excuses. No more cover-ups. This ends now." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. Sheriff Donovan paced the small conference room, his face lined with frustration. Barker and Cole sat across from him, their expressions tense. "They're out of control," Donovan growled, gesturing toward the windows. The sound of the protesters' chants seeped through the walls. "We've got reporters sniffing around, activists making demands, and now the state's breathing down my neck. How did we let it get this far?" Barker sneered. "Reed. He's the one stirring this up. We should have shut him down before it got to this." Donovan shot him a glare. "You had your chance. Now we're dealing with a full-blown crisis. If we don't find a way to contain this, it's over for all of us." Cole spoke up, his voice low. "Maybe we can turn the tide. Discredit Reed. Make him look like the problem." Donovan frowned. "How?" "We've got dirt on him," Cole continued. "His past, his anger issues, the accident in the ring. People will believe he's dangerous if we spin it right." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Do it. Make him the villain. We need to shift the narrative before this gets any worse." By the next morning, the local news had started running stories painting Ethan in a negative light. Old footage of his fights was broadcasted, along with headlines that read, "Boxer turned recluse linked to town unrest," and "Ethan Reed. Trouble past, trouble present." Ethan sat in his cabin, his fists clenched as he watched the coverage. The footage showed clips of his fights, emphasizing his aggression and the accident that had ended his career. "They're trying to bury me," he muttered. Angela, sitting across from him, shook her head. "It's a desperate move. They're throwing everything they have because they know they're losing." "It doesn't matter," Ethan said, his voice hard. "People will believe it. They'll think I'm just some violent guy looking for a fight." Angela leaned forward. "Then prove them wrong. The town's starting to see the truth, Ethan. You've got allies now. We need to keep going." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the smear campaign lingered. He had spent years running from his past, and now it was being weaponized against him. That afternoon, Ethan joined Angela, Mia, and a small group of protesters at a community meeting. Held in the town's church hall, the gathering was packed with residents eager to speak out. One by one, people shared their stories, accounts of harassment, unwarranted stops, and years of silence. "I was pulled over 3 times in 1 week," an elderly man said, his voice shaking. "All because I was driving a car they didn't think I could afford. They arrested my son for nothing," a mother added, tears streaming down her face. "He's still scared to walk alone at night." Ethan listened, his chest tightening with every story. These people had been suffering in silence, just as he had. When the room fell quiet, all eyes turned to him. "Ethan," Mia said softly, "you've been through this too. We need your voice." Ethan stood slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had come together to fight for change. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady. "I came to Cedarville to escape, not to fight. But staying quiet didn't make things better. It just let them win. I'm done running." The room erupted in applause, a wave of encouragement that bolstered Ethan's resolve. That night, Ethan returned to his cabin, the adrenaline of the meeting still coursing through him. But as he approached the door, he noticed something off, the faint sound of footsteps inside. He froze, his heart pounding. Someone was in his cabin. Ethan grabbed the axe leaning against the porch and moved silently to the side window. Peering inside, he saw Barker and Cole rummaging through his belongings. "They're trying to frame me," Ethan thought, his anger surging. He crept around to the back door, slipping inside undetected. Barker was by the table, holding one of Ethan's old trophies, while Cole sifted through a stack of papers. Ethan stepped into the room, his voice calm but firm. "Looking for something?" Barker and Cole spun around, their hands instinctively going to their holsters. "Careful, Reed," Barker sneered. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." "You're the ones breaking and entering," Ethan shot back. "What are you planning to plant this time?" Cole smirked. "Just doing our job, Reed. Making sure you don't cause any more trouble." Ethan's grip tightened on the axe. "Get out. Now." For a moment, the room was electric with tension. Then Barker took a step forward, his hand hovering over his gun. But before he could act, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Barker and Cole exchanged a panicked glance before bolting out the door. Ethan watched them disappear into the night, his chest heaving. Moments later, Angela pulled up in her car, flanked by 2 reporters and a small group of protesters. "They're getting desperate," Angela said, stepping out of the car. Ethan nodded. "Good. That means we're winning." The next morning, Cedarville was buzzing with activity. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters delivered live updates. The exposé had reached state and national outlets, and public pressure was mounting. The town square was filled with protesters holding signs, their chants echoing through the crisp morning air. Ethan Reed stood on the steps of the town hall, watching as Cedarville transformed before his eyes. Beside him stood Angela Porter, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We've come this far," she said. "Now it's up to the people to finish it." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't shake the unease lingering in his chest. Barker, Cole, and Sheriff Donovan hadn't been seen since the confrontation at his cabin the night before. He knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Inside the sheriff's office, chaos reigned. State investigators had arrived, armed with warrants and backed by a team of federal agents. Sheriff Donovan sat behind his desk, his face pale as the lead investigator presented a stack of evidence. "This isn't just misconduct," the investigator said. "We've got complaints of excessive force, falsified reports, and even obstruction of justice." "You're done, Donovan." Donovan glared at Barker and Cole, who stood near the door, their confidence faltering. "This is a witch hunt," Donovan spat. "We've done nothing wrong." "Tell that to the victims," the investigator replied coldly. "We have more than enough to bring charges." Moments later, Donovan was escorted out in handcuffs, his face a mask of humiliation. Barker and Cole weren't far behind, their protests drowned out by the cheers of the crowd outside. Ethan watched from the square, a wave of relief washing over him as the 3 men were loaded into separate police vehicles. For the first time in years, he felt the grip of fear loosening. In the days that followed, Cedarville's story became a national headline. The state launched a full investigation into the town's police department, uncovering years of systemic corruption and abuse. Angela's exposé was hailed as a turning point, sparking conversations about accountability in law enforcement. She received offers from major publications, but she turned them down, choosing to stay in Cedarville to document the town's recovery. Ethan, meanwhile, became an unlikely figure of hope. People who had once avoided him now approached him with gratitude and respect. His story of resilience resonated, inspiring others to speak out against injustice in their own communities. Months later, Cedarville was a town in transition. The sheriff's office was under new leadership, with state-appointed overseers ensuring accountability. Programs were launched to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community, and the protests had given way to town meetings focused on healing and reform. Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. The forest felt different now, less like a cage and more like a home. Angela pulled up in her car, a notebook in hand. She smiled as she approached. "I thought I'd find you here. Where else would I be?" Ethan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Angela sat beside him, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "You did something incredible, Ethan. You stood up when it mattered most. The town owes you a lot." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone, and it wasn't about me. It was about everyone who needed to be heard." Angela nodded, then handed him a copy of her latest article. The headline read, "Cedarville's Redemption, a town's fight for justice." "You're in there," she said. Ethan glanced at the article, then set it aside. "It's not about being remembered. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The following week, Ethan reopened the old barn near his cabin. Once a dilapidated structure, it now served as a community boxing gym. Kids from the town gathered there after school, their laughter and energy filling the space. Ethan guided them through drills, his voice steady and encouraging. "Keep your guard up," he said to a young boy throwing punches at a bag. "You don't just fight with your fists. You fight with your heart and your mind. That's how you win." Mia Turner stopped by one evening, watching from the doorway as Ethan worked with the kids. "You're making a real difference," she said. Ethan smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "They deserve to feel strong, to know they can stand up for themselves." Mia nodded. We all learned that from you. On the anniversary of the protests, the community gathered in the town square for a vigil. Candles lit the night as people shared stories of resilience and hope. Ethan stood in the crowd, his presence a quiet reminder of the power of one voice. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The town's transformation spoke for itself. As the candles flickered in the cool night air, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a man with a past anymore. He was part of something bigger, a community that had found its strength in the face of adversity, and for the first time, Ethan Reed was proud to call Cedarville home.